This is 3-Minute Math with Mr. White. In this segment, we're going to talk about the Pythagorean Theorem and how you can solve for the sides of right triangles. So let's get right to it. So given a right triangle, that is to say that it has a 90-degree angle, you could measure some of the sides, like maybe that side is 11, you can measure the other side, maybe that side is 8, and you could actually use Pythagorean Theorem to figure out the third side on the triangle. So this first example that we're going to do, we're going to actually be solving for the hypotenuse. But what is this Pythagorean Theorem? Pythagorean Theorem, when you have a right triangle with legs A, B, and then hypotenuse C, the Pythagorean Theorem says that the square of one of the legs, we'll call it A, so A squared, plus the square of the other leg, we'll call that B squared, is always going to be equal to the square of the hypotenuse, in this case C, so C squared. So A squared plus B squared equals C squared is Pythagorean's theorem. Now I want to just point out that C is the hypotenuse here, and A and B are the two legs of the triangle. It's important to get them in the right place on the equation when you're doing it. Let's go back to our example where we had the two legs that were 8 and 11. So we're going to go ahead and plug in the fact that one of the legs, A, is 8. So I put it in there as 8 squared. And then B is 11, so I put in 11 squared. And then we don't know what the hypotenuse is, so I'm using the letter x for that. So I put that in there as x squared. Now we simply do some of the calculations. 8 squared is 64, 11 squared is 121, and all that is still equal to x squared. I'm now going to combine the 64 and the 121, and I get 185. Now the question is how on earth do we get rid of that square that's on the x? Well, that's where the square root comes into play. So we're going to square root both sides of this equation, and that cancels the square, leaving x is 13.6. So apparently the hypotenuse on this triangle is 13.6 centimeters. Now let's do another example using Pythagorean theorem, but this time we're going to be solving for the leg of the triangle. So we're going to have to plug x in for either A or B, it doesn't matter. I'm going to use B in my example because that's where the legs go. All right, so let's get right to it. So one of the legs is 8, so I put in my 8 for A, so 8 squared plus our x squared, because that's the one we don't know. All of that is equal to the hypotenuse squared, which is 13. Now let's go ahead and calculate things out. 8 squared is 64, and 13 squared is 169. So I went ahead and plugged that in. Now we're going to move that 64 to the other side by subtracting 64 on both sides, because remember we are solving an equation. So 169 minus 64 is where I got the 105. Now once again we need to get rid of that square on the x. So we're going to square root both sides, type that in the calculator, and you see that the leg is 10.2. That is to say 10.2 centimeters on the original diagram. Now this has been a very quick primer on Pythagorean theorem, both solving for the leg and solving for the hypotenuse in a right triangle. This has been Mr. White with 3-Minute Math.